Hey everyone, welcome to Wealth Redefined. I'm your host, Michael Reynolds, independent financial advisor and owner of Elevation Financial. Thanks for joining me today as always. Glad you are here. All right, should I put my emergency fund in I-bonds? That is our question of the day. So I-bonds have been getting some extra attention lately because inflation is higher than normal right now at the time that this podcast is being broadcast, and the corresponding interest rate with I-bonds is equivalent. It's aligned, and so a lot of people are paying more attention to I-bonds because of the rate of interest being paid. If you're not familiar with I-bonds, I do have an episode on I-bonds. It's episode 142. So if you're completely unfamiliar with I-bonds, maybe go back and listen to that first and then come back to this. But that'll give you a more in-depth overview. But as a basic refresher, I-bonds are issued by the U.S. government, and they're designed to pay an interest rate that corresponds with the current rate of inflation. So again, that's why people are paying attention to I-bonds now, with inflation being so high and the equivalent rate of interest being paid by I-bonds. You can buy up to $10,000 in I-bonds electronically per year per Social Security number or tax ID. I-bonds can't be cashed out for 1 year from the date of purchase. But after that, they can be sold. But the last 3 months of interest is forfeited if it's within the first 5 years of purchase, which is, again, that's not the end of the world. Interest earned on I-bonds is not subject to state or local income taxes. So that's kind of a quick, super fast nutshell review on what I-bonds are. All right. So what role can I-bonds play in your financial plan? So I-bonds typically don't make sense as an investment. Mainly because the interest rate is not designed to outpace inflation. It's designed to keep pace with inflation, but it's not designed to outpace inflation like typical investments would, like in the stock market. But I-bonds can serve as a vehicle for other parts of your financial plan, including your emergency fund in some cases. So your emergency fund is meant to be a safety net or a self-funded insurance policy, so to speak, against unexpected expenses. I also have episodes on emergency funds, so I might want to go back and check those out if you want. So for this reason, your emergency fund should be funded with assets that are, one, liquid, and two, are not at risk for losing value. There's a conversation going around, or has been for a while, about, should you invest your emergency fund? And the current market conditions right now are showing a lot of people that investing your emergency fund is not always a great idea. So again, you want to be liquid and something at risk, not at risk for losing value. So you want your emergency fund to be accessible when you need it, and you also want it to be stable and retain its principal balance, because again, it's not meant to be an investment. It's meant to be an insurance policy. So based on these requirements, the ideal place for an emergency fund, can include savings, money market accounts. Those are pretty common places to store an emergency fund. So these accounts, provide the safety and the liquidity required. But one downside is that money in these accounts will typically not keep pace with inflation. So this leads to decreased effective value over time. And this concerns some people, rightly so. So if you're concerned about inflation, what are some other options for your emergency fund? This is kind of where I-bonds sometimes shine. This is where I-bonds could have a place for some people. Since I-bonds are designed to keep pace with inflation, they can make an ideal vehicle for an emergency fund for those concerned about losing purchasing power over time with cash. So the question is, what about liquidity? Since I-bonds are locked for 1 year, I'm putting locked in quotes, for 1 year after purchase, short-term liquidity is an issue. So hypothetically, for example, if you convert your entire emergency fund over to I-bonds and your car breaks down a week later, you're stuck without an emergency fund. That's not really practical. So because of this, sometimes a slow migration to I-bonds can be a very effective way to build an emergency fund using I-bonds. So one scenario you might consider is kind of what I call the multi-year drip funding option. Not a very elegant term, but I'm going with it. So in this scenario, let's assume your emergency fund is $10,000. I'm just making up a number. Could be more, could be less, but I'm just making up a number. You could take $1,000 out of your emergency fund each year and purchase I-bonds. This gradually shifts your emergency fund from cash to I-bonds over the course of 10 years. It does reduce your emergency fund by 10%, but that's a fairly low risk, reduction, assuming it's fully funded. So let's say your emergency fund goes from $10,000 to $9,000. Yes, you technically have less available in your emergency fund for a period of time, but it's not a dramatic decrease. Of course, you could always do this a different way. You could always just keep your emergency fund where it is and then just add new money to I bonds and then kind of do a shuffle a different way. But this is just one scenario. And again, if you don't want to take that long, let's say you want to convert your existing emergency fund to I bonds, you may not want to wait that long. Maybe you want to convert at a faster rate. There can be cases where a faster migration is possible without taking on too much risk. For example, do you have liquid investments that can act as a supplement or a backup emergency fund during the transition? For example, do you have a brokerage account that's not inside an IRA? It's more of just a general brokerage account with no liquidity issues, no penalties. Do you have money in those types of accounts? Even if it's invested and at risk of losing temporary value, it's still there and could be acting as a supplement or backup. Is your household income stable enough to allow for a reduced emergency fund for a period of time? Maybe you are lower risk because you're a dual income household, jobs are extremely stable. That could be something to consider as well. With your debt situation, if you have zero debt or low debt, that reduces your risk as well. Is your life and disability insurance current and adequate? If you have, current life insurance, current disability insurance, that reduces your risk as well. And do you have other safety nets or other sources of liquidity that lower your risk? So, at an extreme example, let's say the only savings you have is your emergency fund. You have no other investments. Your job is very volatile, single income household, not a big safety net. You want to be very conservative and very careful about this. On the flip side, maybe a dual income household, extremely stable jobs. You've got brokerage accounts with investments in there. You've got a safety net of relatives nearby that could help out in a pinch very easily. You've got disability insurance in place. Like all these things are in place. Yeah, you can probably migrate at a faster pace or take a little more risk with liquidity as you add I bonds into the mix. So just think about that. Everyone's situation is going to be different with this. So if your personal situation supports it, it may be feasible to migrate in a shorter amount of time. For example, converting at a rate of 25% per year results in a 4-year migration path. So just keep that in mind. Every situation is different. So while one advantage of using I bonds for your emergency fund is that it keeps up with inflation, there's another practical benefit that I really like, and that is friction. So this is more of a behavioral aspect that can be very helpful to some people. So an emergency fund is meant to be a stopgap for unexpected expenses. However, it's not uncommon for these funds to be rated for other things when temptation strikes, for things like vacations, cars, non-emergency big purchases. We're all human. We all fall prey to temptation sometimes. I've seen cases where emergency funds are used for things that are not emergencies, and that's a behavioral challenge to overcome. So it can be really challenging to resist cash that's readily accessible sitting right there in your account. However, I bonds come with a lot of friction. If you've ever tried logging into the Treasury Direct website, it's kind of a pain. It requires jumping through all sorts of hoops. There's login quirks. It doesn't behave the way you would expect. It doesn't link up with other tools as well. So you can't see your balance using common finance apps. You have to actually log into the website and see it there. It's very kind of walled off. It's very, I don't want to say difficult because it's obviously you can get to it, but it's clumsy and clunky, and there's a lot of friction when it comes to accessing your I bonds. So because I bonds are so out of sight, out of mind, they can be a very effective way to manage your behavior when it comes to preserving your emergency fund. So it kind of keeps you from dipping into your emergency fund, willy-nilly on a whim or impulsively. So if you're someone that struggles with keeping cash on hand because you are so tempted to use it, I bonds have a really neat behavioral aspect in that practical, useful friction is there to keep it preserved. So to summarize, I bonds can, in some cases, be a great place to keep your emergency fund because of the following benefits. 1, keeping up with inflation. And 2, the behavioral benefit of creating useful friction that discourages inappropriate use. So, one thing to keep in mind is the caveat here I want to end with also is it's really important still to keep a good amount of cash on hand. So let's say the bulk of your emergency fund is in I bonds. If you have no other cash on hand, that's kind of a backup, that could be a concern because, again, there could be emergencies where you need cash that day. You need to be able to make a quick transfer and pay for something that day. I bonds can take a few days or a while to get access to your funds. So I do recommend keeping at least some cash on hand in savings. How much is going to depend on your situation, but don't make your entire emergent or your entire pile of liquidity just in I bonds. Make sure you have some cash in savings in the bank that's available immediately. So if these benefits appeal to you and you feel comfortable with the migration path and your risk profile is appropriate, I bonds can be a great place for part or even all of your emergency fund. So all right. So Leslie has stopped by on Facebook. I do these via live as well as the podcast. So on Facebook, Leslie has stopped by on Facebook saying, "Yay, I love this topic. I've moved over half my emergency fund to I bonds a little bit every week." Awesome, Leslie. Sounds like you're on board with this as well. And Leslie also followed up with another comment. It's been a little fast for Michael, I know, but I tick off a few of the other boxes. Great. So yeah, this is a good example where everyone's situation is different. And it sounds like, Leslie, your situation, you're comfortable with the risk. You have other elements that we discussed in place here that minimize the risk, and you feel comfortable with the pace of migration to using I bonds for your emergency fund. So that's important that you've analyzed other areas of your life and you feel comfortable with it. So appreciate you sharing that. All right. So thanks for joining me today. As always, hope this has given you some tools to think about when it comes to using I bonds for your emergency fund. As always, if you have any questions, you can reach out to me on my website, which is elevationfinancial.com. There's a button on the homepage called Book a Complimentary Money Session. So if you ever have questions, you can always reach out. And if you're not a client, you can still ask questions. I'm happy to chat with you. And if you want to discuss becoming a client, you're welcome to, but you don't have to. My main concern is just answering your questions. So feel free to reach out and I'll be happy to help. Again, elevationfinancial.com. Thanks for joining me today. As always, have a great day. We'll see you next time.